It was 7:12 in the morning when my phone rang. I know the exact time because I had just poured my first cup of coffee and set it on the counter to cool. I remember looking at the clock on the microwave. 7:12. I remember thinking it was too early for anyone to be calling. It was my sister. She said our father had fallen in the bathroom. He was 79 years old, lived alone in the house he'd owned for 41 years. The same house I grew up in, the same house where my mother died. She said he was conscious but couldn't get up. She was 3 states away in Phoenix and couldn't get there until the next evening at the earliest. I told her I'd go. I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then I walked to the bedroom doorway. My wife was still in bed. She had the covers pulled up around her shoulders the way she always did, and the room was dark except for the gray light coming through the curtains. I stood there and told her what happened. I told her my father had fallen, and I needed to drive over to his place and probably get him to the hospital to be checked out. She didn't sit up. She didn't turn toward me. She said, "Can't your sister handle it?" I said, "My sister was in Phoenix." She said, "What about a neighbor?" I told her he was 79 and he was on the floor and he needed someone to go. She was quiet for a moment and she said, "I have my thing with Deborah today. We've had it planned for 3 weeks." I didn't say anything. She said, "You know how hard it is to get a reservation at that place." I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, the bedroom we had shared for 22 years, and I listened to my wife explain why a lunch reservation was a reasonable thing to weigh against my father lying on the bathroom floor at 79 years old. I listened to all of it, and when she was done, I said, "Okay, just that. Okay." I went back to the kitchen and I left my coffee sitting on the counter. I picked up my keys. I want to be honest about what I was feeling in that moment, because I've thought about it a lot since. I wasn't surprised. That's the part that should have alarmed me more than anything else. I wasn't surprised at all. What I felt was something quieter than anger, something that had been settling in for a long time, like sediment at the bottom of a glass. I just hadn't held the glass up to the light in a while. My father's name is Leonard. He turned 79 in March. He is not a man who asks for help. He was a line foreman at a paper mill for 31 years, and he raised 2 kids, mostly on his own after my mother got sick. And he has never once in my memory said the words, "I can't do this." So when I got to his house and found the front door unlocked, he'd managed to drag himself to the front door and unlock it before losing the strength to get up. And I found him sitting on the bathroom floor with his back against the tub. I understood exactly what it had taken for him to make that call. He had a bruised hip. Not broken, which was the miracle. The ER doctor said another inch in any direction and we'd be looking at surgery. He said it like it was a close call and moved on to the next patient. To me, it felt like the whole room tilted for a second. I sat with my father in that ER for 6 hours. We didn't talk much. That's not our way. But at one point, he asked me where my wife was, and I told him she had a prior commitment. He looked at me for a moment, and then he looked back at the ceiling and he said, just that. My father has never been a man to editorialize, but I know what that meant. He's known her for 22 years. I got him home that night, set him up in his recliner, made sure he had everything he needed within reach. My neighbor's daughter, she's in her 30s, good kid, agreed to check on him in the mornings for the next week. I paid her in cash, $200, money I took from my own checking account. Not our joint account, my own. That detail matters. I'll come back to it. I drove home around 9 o'clock that night. The house was quiet. My wife was in the living room watching television. She looked up when I came in and she said, "How is he?" I said he was okay. Bruised hip. Could have been much worse. She said, "Good, I'm glad he's okay." And she turned back to the TV. I went to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a while. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't tired exactly, even though I had been awake since before 7 and had spent most of the day in a hospital. I was something else. I was in that particular kind of stillness that comes when something is finished inside you. Not broken, finished. Like a clock that's wound all the way down. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went online and I looked at our joint savings account. I want to explain something about how things worked in our marriage financially because I think it's important for understanding what came next. I'm 63 years old. I worked in civil engineering for 34 years. I want to be careful here. I started at 29 after graduate school. So yes, the math works out. And I retired 2 years ago with a decent pension and a 401k that I had been building for 3 decades. My wife worked part-time on and off through the years, mostly bookkeeping for small businesses, and I had no issue with that. We had agreed on it when our kids were young. I earned. She managed the house. That was our arrangement, and I honored it. What I had not done, and I am not proud of this, was pay close attention to where the money was going. I trusted her. 22 years. I trusted her. When I looked at the joint savings account that morning, I found that over the previous 14 months, a total of $63,000 had been moved out. Not all at once, in transfers of $3,000, $4,000, sometimes $5,000. Irregular enough to not trigger any automatic alerts, regular enough to add up to $63,000. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The transfers went to an account I didn't recognize. I wrote down the last 4 digits and the routing information. Then I closed the laptop and I drove to our bank. The branch manager was a woman named Sandra. And I want to be clear, I'm using a different name here because I don't think her real name matters. And she was professional and careful, and I could tell she had done this before. She confirmed that the transfers had been authorized using my wife's login credentials from an account that was jointly held to a separate individual account that was in my wife's name only. She told me what she could and couldn't tell me. She told me I should speak to an attorney. I thanked her, and I left. I did not go home. I drove around for probably 40 minutes. I went past my father's house just to drive past it. I don't know why. I just needed to see it. That house has been standing since 1968. It has outlasted everything. I called my son that afternoon. He's 38. Lives in Columbus, works in logistics. He and his wife have 2 kids, my grandchildren, a boy and a girl. I did not tell him everything. I told him his grandfather was doing okay and that I was handling some things and I might need his help in the next few weeks. He said, of course. He said, call any time. That's how he is. He got that from my father, I think, not from me. I'm still learning it. I also called a friend I've known since college. His name is Theodore. We call him Theo. And he is a retired family law attorney. I told him I needed to talk. He said, come over. I spent 3 hours at Theo's kitchen table. I want to be careful about how much I say here because some of this is still ongoing, legally. But what Theo explained to me was that in our state, transfers from a joint account, even to a separate account, made during the marriage are presumed to be marital funds, and that documentation of those transfers could be very significant in a divorce proceeding. He also explained the difference between divorce and legal separation, and why, in certain circumstances, legal separation is not the weaker option. It gives you time. It establishes a legal record. It protects the marital estate while things get sorted. I want to address something directly, because I've seen questions like this before and I understand why people ask. Why not just file for divorce immediately? I get it. I understand why that seems like the obvious move, but Theo explained to me, and I think this is important, that acting in haste when significant assets are involved can actually hurt you. If you file before you've documented everything, before you've secured what's yours, you can find yourself in a worse position legally. Patience, in this case, was not weakness. Patience was strategy. I drove home that evening and I made dinner. My wife came into the kitchen around 6 and she seemed surprised that I was cooking. I made the chicken soup that I always make, the one I learned from my mother. My wife sat down at the table, and we ate together and we talked about nothing in particular. She mentioned something about a sale at a home goods store. I listened. I nodded. I was very calm. Calm is different from okay. I need to make that clear. The next few weeks were a careful time. I continued to check on my father every other day. He was getting around better, using a cane temporarily, and he'd gotten stubborn about it the way he always gets stubborn, which I took as a good sign. The neighbor's daughter was still checking in mornings, and he'd started to look forward to it, which was its own small miracle. I opened my own separate checking account at a different bank. I began having my pension deposited there instead. I spoke twice more with Theo. I gathered paperwork, statements, records, the deed to our house, still jointly held, both names, which matters, insurance documents, everything I could access and copy and put somewhere safe. I was not sneaking around. I was being thorough. My wife did not notice any of this. That told me something. It was on a Tuesday, about 5 weeks after my father's fall, that my wife came home from wherever she'd been and walked into the kitchen and found me sitting at the table with a folder in front of me. She looked at the folder. She looked at me. Something shifted in her face. I told her I thought we needed to talk. I don't want to reconstruct the whole conversation. Some of it is too personal, and some of it is too painful, and some of it is too painful, and some of it, frankly, is still too raw. But I'll tell you the shape of it. She cried. She said she'd been unhappy for a long time. She said she felt like we had grown apart. She said the money was hers to use because she had sacrificed her career for our family. She said a lot of things that I had probably needed to hear years ago, and I tried to really listen to them instead of just defending myself. Some of what she said had truth in it. We had grown apart. I had not been an easy man to be married to. I am aware of my own failures. But then I slid a paper across the table. It was a printed summary of the transfers. $63,000 over 14 months. The room got very quiet. She said she was going to pay it back. I said, I know. And that was the moment, I think, when she understood that I wasn't angry. I wasn't there to yell or to threaten or to fall apart. I had already moved through all that alone. In the car, in Theo's kitchen, in the parking lot of my father's hospital at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night. I had already done the hard emotional work. What was left was practical. And I was prepared to be very practical. I had filed for legal separation 3 days earlier. She found out when her attorney called her. I won't pretend that wasn't deliberate. It was deliberate. I had been married to this woman for 22 years, and I had spent enough of that marriage reacting and accommodating and assuming good faith. I was done assuming. There were phone calls, there were messages, there were attempts to renegotiate. My phone showed 31 missed calls in the 48 hours after she found out about the filing. Some from her, some from her sister, one from a number I didn't recognize which turned out to be a mutual friend she'd apparently enlisted. 31 calls in 48 hours. I answered none of them, not because I was punishing her, because I'd already said what I needed to say and there was nothing left for me to react to. My son came up that weekend. We sat on the back porch and drank coffee and he asked me how I was doing, and I told him the truth, which is that I was okay. Not happy. Not unhappy. Okay in the way that you feel okay when something that has been quietly wrong for a very long time has finally been named. There is relief in naming things, even painful things. He asked me if I thought it could have been saved. The marriage. I thought about that for a while before I answered. I said I thought there were probably 10 or 12 moments over the past decade where we could have turned toward each other and didn't, and I couldn't tell you whose fault that was. I own some of those moments, maybe more than I've been comfortable admitting. What I knew with certainty was that the morning she had rolled over and talked about a lunch reservation while my father was on the bathroom floor, that was not a moment where we could have turned toward each other. That was a moment where I finally saw clearly which direction we were each facing. My father is doing better. He gave up the cane last month, which his doctor recommended he keep using, but which he ignored because that is exactly who he is. He started going to a senior center 3 days a week, which I genuinely did not expect. He says the coffee is bad, but the card games are decent. I visit him on Sundays now, most weeks. We sit in his living room and drink his bad coffee, and sometimes we watch old westerns on his TV, the kind he's always liked. We don't talk about everything. We don't have to. But something between us is easier now, and I'm not entirely sure how to explain that except to say that I think he sees me differently since that morning. Not with more respect, exactly. More like recognition, like he knows now that when it matters, I show up. That means more to me than I expected it to. The legal process is ongoing, and I won't say more about it than that. My attorney is good. Theo has been invaluable. I sleep better than I have in years, which I take as information. I think about that morning a lot. The phone ringing at 7:12. The coffee on the counter. Standing in the bedroom doorway and telling my wife that my father had fallen, and the moment, the precise, quiet moment, when I understood that her answer was going to be about herself. A lot of my marriage was in that moment, looking back. A lot of years of small decisions that I had told myself were compromise, were accommodation, were the normal give and take of a long partnership, and maybe some of them were, but some of them were something else. And the difference I've come to understand is direction. Compromise moves toward the other person. What I had been doing for a long time was just moving out of the way. I'm 63 years old. That is not too late. I want to be clear about that. People hear that number and they hear an ending. But I don't feel like an ending. I feel like a man who finally put his coffee down and walked toward something instead of away from it. My father would not say any of this out loud. But last Sunday, when I got up to leave and put on my coat, he looked up from the television and he said, "Same time next week?" I said yes. He nodded and turned back to the screen. That was enough. I've thought a lot about what it means to finally see clearly, not dramatically, not in a moment of rage or tears, just clearly. The way you see a room after someone opens the curtains you've gotten so used to being closed that you've forgotten there was a window there at all. That morning when I drove to my father's house alone, I wasn't thinking about what I was going to do next. I was just doing the next right thing. Get to him. Get him checked. Get him home safe. That's all. And somewhere in the middle of doing those ordinary, necessary things, something shifted that I don't think will ever shift back. I've made a lot of accommodations in my life. I told myself they were patience, maturity. The give and take of a long marriage, and some of them were. But there is a difference. And I think this is something that takes most people a long time to learn, if they learn it at all. There's a real difference between choosing to give something and slowly losing the habit of expecting anything in return. Those two things can look identical from the outside for years. They don't feel identical. Not if you're honest with yourself. What I know now is that character shows up in small moments, not in speeches, not in grand gestures. It shows up at 7:12 in the morning when someone you love is on a bathroom floor and the person next to you starts talking about a lunch reservation. That's the moment. That's when you find out what you're actually dealing with. And that's also, if you're paying attention, when you find out something about yourself, about whether you're going to keep looking away or finally hold the glass up to the light. I'm not angry at my wife. I want to be clear about that. Anger would be easier in some ways. What I feel is more like grief. And underneath the grief, something I didn't expect, relief. The relief of not pretending anymore. The relief of making a decision with my eyes open instead of squinting to make things look better than they are. My father sat on his bathroom floor for God knows how long before he made that call. That man does not ask for help. He never has. And I think about what it cost him to dial my number that morning. And I think about what it would have cost me, what it would have meant about the kind of man I am, if I had let a lunch reservation be the reason I didn't answer. We don't get to choose every circumstance that tests us. We don't get to schedule the hard moments for when it's convenient. The test shows up when it shows up. What we do in that moment is who we are. I'm 63. I have plenty of road behind me and I hope enough ahead. What I want to do with what's left is simpler than what I was doing before. Show up. Pay attention. Stop moving out of the way and start moving toward something. Toward my father on Sunday mornings. Toward my son and his kids. Toward the version of myself that I can actually respect when the room gets quiet. That's not a small thing. For me, right now, that's everything.